The Office of the Parliament celebrates International Women's Day 2022. Gender equality today for a sustainable tomorrow.
International Women's Day for me is a day of celebration and reflection of all of the work that women's activists, feminist activists around the world have been doing to advance gender justice in their own territories. I think it's also a day for mourning, looking at how many women and girls across the world have lost their fight in this work, women who are victims of violence, who are still victims of abuse. And I think the day has that duality, where you can celebrate all the progress that has been made, reflect on what has been done, but also mourn and understand that in this work there are people who are victims, and we have to ensure that we also advocate for them too and keep them in mind throughout this work. So I actually opted to use the term gender justice, even though those two concepts they kind of relate to each other. Gender equality, it always moves the marker for where women and girls have to get to. So it looks at, of course, equality of people regardless of their sex, of their gender, of their race, of their backgrounds. But justice, it looks at a more equitable approach. So whilst we know that there are people with different abilities, gender justice seeks to redistribute that power and the resources that are available to ensure that everyone has some sort of access to the same opportunities. So let's say someone, they already may have a lot of resources. You won't give somebody who does not have any resources the same amount, right? You have to ensure that it's properly distributed in a way where they actually can have access to these opportunities, because having access to the opportunity doesn't mean that you can actually be able to achieve it and afford it. So it looks at putting the mechanisms in place so that they too can have access to it. So justice to me, in that case, looks at that redistribution of power and ensuring that things are put in place to support those who are vulnerable in society. Actually, there aren't new issues that affect gender justice. These issues have always been existing, but what has changed is our access to information. With social media, with Twitter, I wake up on mornings and I'm able to see exactly what's happening around the world just by scrolling. And so we are now more sensitized. We have the information that's more accessible to us. So some of the issues can seem new. When we look at the lack of access to contraception to some women and girls around the world, when we look at period poverty, these have all been issues that have been existing forever. I've seen people talk about gender-based violence being a new issue. But when I look at papers from 1990 and see the front page that says women under siege, you realize that we have always been fighting for these issues. But the access to information has changed, and I say that is something that is new, being able to actually see these issues front and center. So gender-based violence exists in a lot of spheres, and with the advent of social media, like anything, you see some of the ills that are leaking through. And so with this new age, you realize that young people are at an increased risk of gender-based violence on social media. There is revenge porn, there's voyeurism, there is doxing, cyberbullying, and now looking at the COVID-19 pandemic and students having to be more online, you see the formation of groups on Telegram, on WhatsApp chats, where nude photos of women are being shared in these group chats, and it's sort of hard to figure out how to trace these issues, how to criminalize it, how to ensure that the perpetrators are actually brought to account. And so these are the issues that we see a lot on social media, knowing it affects everyone, even young men. But when we look at the statistics and look at how women are usually affected, you see that difference as to how many women are usually victims of these crimes. So it's unfortunate that with something so great and new, that we still have to see violence in that sphere too, but it definitely does exist. I think Trinidad and Tobago has a lot of great legislation, but a lot of people aren't aware of the policies that are actually in place to help them. And so when you have that knowledge gap of, so how can I actually get justice? You see people not actually trusting the system, not wanting to report, or not wanting to take the avenues to actually get justice. But also, legislation doesn't change culture exactly. We actually have to change the education system, and this takes a lot of work. It takes years. So you need that education shift and that cultural shift, and you need legislation to back it up. So it's that process that needs both, like every particular system that we exist in, to work together for there to be change. But because we can have legislation and we still see a lot of people committing crimes knowing that they can be criminalized for it. So it's a lot of work that has to go into ensuring that these systems actually work. Yeah, I have had the privilege to work with a lot of young, amazing activists. There is Sophia Alexander, who runs Caribbean Feminist, Renuka Ananjit, who's the coordinator for IGDS Ignite, and she works at the Institute for Gender and Development Studies, doing her PhD. There is Deidre Williams, who's a strong, long-time youth development advocate who works with young girls. There's Chanel Beatrice, who works with Feminite, and there's so many more people. There's Johanna Ray Reyes, there's Sophia Acosta, and these people are committed to the work of advancing gender justice, not just for women and girls, but for gender diverse people, and for us all in this society. Even when there is a movement, a feminist movement that is supposed to be inclusive, there are still people within that movement that are left behind. So we know for women's suffrage, black women weren't able to actually vote when they could have voted because there were various requirements when you had to go vote. You had the literacy tests, the poll fines, and of course that excludes the most vulnerable in society. And so when we think about that type of issue in a movement, we realize that it still actually exists. When we are advocating for the rights of women, what type of women are we actually advocating for? And we see a lot of poor black women in rural communities. Some of them aren't properly advocated for because they aren't consulted. And so when we think about breaking apart the issue of women's suffrage, breaking apart the right to work, we realize that we actually do still have some of those issues that would have actually not allowed them to get that. But when we, looking at what exists now in terms of advocacy, there is a lot of advocacy around sexual and reproductive health and rights, looking at period poverty, looking at access to proper health care, affordable health care, looking at education. Even though we do have free education in Trinidad and Tobago and it's quite accessible, there are some communities that are unable to access it, not because it's not there, but because it can be costly if you have to pay for uniform, for books, for transportation, and then, of course, understanding that the issue of violence is still quite pervasive when we see how many women are killed. And yes, when we think about the amount of crime that is committed, it looks like it was a small scale, but look at the reasoning for why women are killed, right? They're victims of their partners. So we know that the issue of ownership, of seeing women as having bodily autonomy, it becomes very difficult for us to really figure out what the solution is. I mean, we've seen a lot of advocacy around, women choose better partners, but it's not as simple. That doesn't remove the issue of gender-based violence. We have to actually attack the root. It has to be transformative in that way, so that women aren't seen as anybody's property, that they can actually show up and that be enough, and not be held to account as to the system of the patriarchy where we have to fit into these boxes of gender roles. So these are some issues that definitely has taken more front and center, but we have to figure out in our advocacy to not perpetuate the same issues that once happened, where we only advocate for a certain type of woman when we think about advocating for these issues. My message for women for International Women's Day is to take up space. It's very hard as a young person to show up in spaces and think that it's enough, but that is enough. Your experiences, your realities, the knowledge that you have, it is valuable and it is needed in order to transform this society. Another message I'd say is to build a community of care and love. It's very hard sometimes when we think about the glass ceiling, and sometimes women themselves are perpetrators for the same issues that we advocate against, where we don't see young people as equal partners. We're not kind to other young women. But it's important for this work, for the advocacy, that you actually build a community where you help each other, because it's not about position, it's not about power, it's about liberation. And it's important for us to see each other as building that community, and that is very important. So take up space and build a community of care and love.
The Office of the Parliament celebrates International Women's Day 2022. Gender equality today for a sustainable tomorrow.